Lovely. It's so nice to be here with you.
It's wonderful. Max.
Yes. Let me introduce you to the author briefly, and then we'll learn more about Manu as the evening proceeds. But
For sure.
As you can read on the back of your book, Manuela Zechner is a researcher, educator, and organizer. She is co-founder of Common Ecology's School, produces the Earthcare Fieldcast, and is affiliated with the Center for Applied Ecological Thinking at Copenhagen University.
That's right.
Before I ask you a bit about the book, I want to ask you to read for us the first page and a half of the first chapter, because I think it's very poetic and it somehow conveys a huge amount about not just what's in the book, but the spirit of the book.
Cool.
Yes.
And let me just say, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Max, for being with us. Thanks for having us and having me. And lovely to see some beloved faces in this audience and some new ones. Okay, so this is the introduction, which is called The Plot is on Fire. The plot is on fire. While the earth soars with heat and damage and our livelihoods become increasingly impossible, the old narratives of progress crackle and catch flame. The plots and plans we had made for ourselves are up in the air. We urgently need some sort of counter-planning. Earthcare counter-planning. Our plot, entanglement and connectedness to concrete and bounded terrains of care and struggle, building communities and new plots amongst the ruins. Using ashes as fertilizer, honoring the power of water, soil, and seed, kindling our fiery metabolic energies, transitioning towards more liveliness. The earth is our plot. We have no other. We are ultimately all workers of the earth. The plot that is on fire is threefold. First, the grand narrative of modernization and progress. Second, the agricultural plots largely turned into plantations. And third, the plans we have for ourselves, collectively as well as individually. Fields and forests have largely been turned into plantations and monocultures that easily catch fire and then also flood, destroy soil and water, putting lives, livelihoods, and our food safety into question. We need another model of agriculture and socio-ecological reproduction, another way of caring for our own survival in the earth, another kind of relation to life altogether. How we feed ourselves is at the core of this, and we don't need grand technological fixes to save us in this, because we have strong cultures of earth care behind us, those of the peasantry that fed us for centuries and millennia, as well as indigenous and other land-living livelihoods. The grand plot of modernization is on fire because there are many of us returning to the small plots where we can grow food and community, build autonomy and care. There is something beautiful and powerful happening across these plots. They are on fire with energy, power, and invention. Many of us feel this fire as something shared, a source of hope in the midst of destruction, a necessary and painful transformation of energy that will leave us with a different matter. Ashes are also fertilizer. They can start a new cycle of growth. Within and around all these plots of care, there are stories, communities, and struggles, more than any book could capture and document. You still want me to go on?
No.
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 I figured.
Well, yes, but we want them to buy the book.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
What I wanted to, I didn't mean to be so abrupt when I said no. What I wanted to bring out is a few things that I think come out right in the opening pages, and one of them is that this is going to be a book that is very comprehensive in its scope. It's really trying to help us think beyond a bunch of traps and impasses that are not just about like how are we going to organize, but how are we going to organize like life and care on a really fundamental level, and then also to introduce the listeners to this lovely way that you're using the word plot in these kind of multiple different registers. Could you briefly go through the registers that you're using that term plot to begin?
Yeah. So it was already there a bit in what I just read. There's the plot in the sense of the narrative, the storyline, right? The way that we tell ourselves what's coming. There's a plot of progress. It's a lot to do with imaginaries of techno-scientific progress, modernization. So in the book that plays out in relation to agriculture, but it also plays out in relation to digitalization and technology more largely. Then there's the plot in the sense of the field, the piece of land, the piece of earth, where we might grow things. So that's to do with agriculture and the crisis of agriculture specifically. And it's a lot to do also with scale, in the sense the plot is like a dimension, in some sense, on which we can grow things and still relate to them with care. So in that sense, the plot is opposed to the plantation in agriculture. And I'm drawing there on the work of Sylvia Winter, who speaks about the plot versus the plantation. And the way she talks about it is that the plot is where we produce use value, whereas the plantation is where we extract from the earth for exchange value, basically. So there's the plot in that sense, and it's about land and soil, but we can think about the plot as a dimension in other senses too, right? And then there's a sense of the plot as a plan, plotting and planning. So there's a question of how do we look into the future and plan ahead or think about what's coming. And the book there plays both on the question of the kind of cultures of prepping that currently exists with relation to ideas of climate doom and these being specific, very masculinist, kind of nationalist often cultures that prep. And the book offers a kind of critique of this kind of prepping and offers a sort of idea of care as a form of counter-prepping. Well, we can go into that later. So there's the question also of how do we look ahead and how do we plot or counter-plan. So that notion of plotting is also to do with, like different feminist legacies of, there's the work, for instance, of Silvia Federici and other people where they speak about counter-planning from the kitchen. So it's the question of how do we plan and plot from the reproductive sphere rather than from the top down and from the high offices of power. And there's also things like, fugitive planning that Stefano Harnian and Fred Moten and so on have written around. So there's a lot of play on the question of how might we plan and maybe also actually disrupt capitalist planning. So there's also a lot of talk in the book about different kinds of tactics for struggle. And one of those kinds of tactics might be to do, for instance, with actually disrupting things like planning permissions. But we can go into that more later.
Yes. Yes, we're going to go into so many of these things.
Yeah.
Over the next roughly 40 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you folks for questions or so, if that's good. Okay, before we dig into the concepts, I want to talk about a couple of things that appear on the back of this book. It says you're I'm asking this question as if I don't know, but many of our listeners don't know. You're the co-founder of the Common Ecologies School. Tell us about Common Ecologies and what you do there.
Common Ecologies is basically, we call ourselves a movement school. It's a movement school without walls, so we don't have a building, but it's a web of people, a collective of people, mostly based in Europe, but also especially across the ocean, also in Latin America, coming from different movements. Climate movements, feminist, transecofeminist movements, labor movements, and basically what we do as a movement school is we facilitate conversations, courses, core research processes, and translations, because we often work across languages and across places, to learn from people in different movements, talk about the kind of tactics and strategies they use in their struggle, and put them into exchange also. And this book is very much nourished by all this, by at least 5 years of this work.
Mm-hmm. I could really sense it when reading the book. It's an amazing book and quite singular in the sense that it's full of references, and I'd say like half of those references are to like radical theory, and then half of the references are to people that you've worked with or engaged with in the process of caring for Common Ecologies as this kind of movement school. Yeah. One of the things that you do adjacent to that is producing the earthcare fieldcast. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So earthcare is a concept that is also very much in this book. There was a previous version of the title of that book was Earthcare Transitioning, which thankfully Pluto wouldn't let me have because it wouldn't have been as good a title, but it is in there in the text. So the Earthcare Fieldcast is basically a podcast that visits people very often in the fields, literally, or on their plots, we could say. So that's why we called it a field cast. And it was a way for me and others also, because I often have co-hosts in the podcast, to think through different struggles around agriculture, around land, around rural spaces, that could be to do with agriculture specifically, but could also be to do, for instance, with tech infrastructure, claiming land, agricultural land, and all kinds of struggles that are basically to do with land and earth.
One of the characters who recurs throughout the book is your grandmother, who was very connected to the land, and she is a character that sometimes I feel in the story that you tell helps you narrate different moments in your life when you've returned to land in various ways, either physically or in the imagination. But maybe for our listeners, were you always concerned with agriculture and rural politics, or was it how did you come to it, or how did you come back to it?
Yeah, I was not at all always concerned with this. Actually, I've been working more on city-related things for a long time. My previous book was about municipalist movements and care commons in the city of Barcelona specifically. I sort of turned to look at agriculture slowly, I think, through seeing climate crisis and ecological crisis unfold, and coming back to those sort of uncomfortable, unresolved questions to do with also my family, my grandmother, but also seeing people in different climate movements, maybe sometimes, well, anyways, starting to learn from peasant movements and different agroecological movements. And so, how do I? And so I think somehow like land and earth and how we actually grow food and sustain ourselves through that is a question that imposes itself more and more, both because of the external circumstances of the crisis that we face, but also because of, obviously, there was the COVID pandemic that drew a lot of people out of the cities and drew us to question profoundly our connection to food chains and supply chains, right? So there was a need to kind of face up to that. So that's how I came to this. I had these little bits and pieces to connect to. My grandmother, for instance, who was a peasant in the Austrian mountains. But there was more questions than answers, I would say, because it's an incredibly complex field. The history of the peasantry is an extremely complex field. The kinds of struggles and tensions and differences that exist within, rural and agrarian movements are huge. So the book doesn't profess to give some grand truth or ultimate kind of verdict on any of that, but it actually really tries to grapple with some of those burning questions and contradictions that we face when we start to look to the countryside. And it starts a little bit from this place of saying, well, me, as for example, but so many of us have like just one or two jumps of generation down the line, people in our families that were peasants, because most people were peasants. Not that long ago, there was a hell of a lot of peasants, and there's there's a story there and a memory and practical knowledge also, that has been erased super fast, right, over just a matter of generations. I mean, I remember my grandma taking me to the field and picking potatoes and little bits and pieces like this. I remember I interviewed her once, and she would say, yeah, then after the war, the Americans came and they brought all these products and everything grew like 3 and 4 times as fast. And she said it with a suspicion and a sense of like, she didn't like that somehow, but she didn't have a way to critique it either. And that's a little bit, I think, where the book also enters. Like, where is this contradiction, but also how can we understand somebody like her, or kind of go into where she's coming from when she narrates this story, not as one of success, which is how it's often told. There's the official narrative is that of the Green Revolution, of the industrialization of agriculture, right? Which has actually displaced and erased a huge amount of peasants. And there's enormous peasant suicides, right, for that precise reason, which has forced a lot of people to give up their agricultural practices, which they would actually rather have preferred to keep in many cases. But that grand narrative of progress and modernization is such that the idea is that nobody would ever want to do farming anyways. And it's very much the same narrative that we have when it comes to care work, actually. Yeah, agriculture is associated with the bodily work, something that seemed to be dirty, the soil is dirty, and there's somehow they say that nobody would want to do that anyways, right? why would anybody want to like change nappies, right, or wipe somebody's ass? And as a matter of fact, some people, and actually I think most of us should be perfectly capable and fine to do that, maybe not 24/7 under super exploited shitty circumstances, but this is part of tending to life. So the book also starts from a very sort of eco-feminist and trans-eco-feminist look at agriculture that says, well, there's so many similarities between care work and agricultural work and the way that work is devalued. And there's a need to politicize it and reread it and kind of find ourselves in it again. And that's a little bit what I tried to do.
Yeah, and one of the things I like is that in the spirit of asking these very difficult questions, very like ontologically and epistemologically difficult questions, because we're so habituated into this, here we are in the middle of the city of London, and many of us are very urban in our imaginations and our beings. Being able to think towards these more rural and land engaged horizons is a real challenge for the imagination. And what I really like about the book is that you take us there not only by giving us the theory, which is very robust and rigorous and sophisticated, but you also take us to, for instance, like John Berger's engagements with peasants in the French Alps. You take us to speculative fiction of Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin. You take us to stories you learned from your grandmother. You also take us to engagements with your own body. For instance, the book ends with this really interesting engagement with your back, and sort of why do you reach for all of those different archives, or maybe to use the terminology from the book, those transcestries, in order to tell this story?
Yeah, I think the book tries to not speak on behalf of peasants, right? Because, the point is not to say we all need to become peasants again and we're going to go back to exactly what was there before. But it also very much goes against the idea that the future is this linear trajectory towards techno-scientific domination, and sovereignty or whatever. And so I think there's many different stories that show also of many different social movements, right, in the book that work their way into caring with and for the earth and other species, and include those species, including the human animal species, let's say, to produce earthcare somehow. And so there's not just one way of looking at that or going at that. So I think the book tries to look at very many ways of re-engaging or engaging with a question of care beyond just the human. Without any of them being superior to the other somehow. So I think it's a bit like trying to hold up a lot of mirrors to the same issue and to point a little bit to possibilities maybe, or to me they're like little doors into what we could become. Because there's also there's a lot of narrative bits and kind of poetic bits in the book, right? And I try to write like that because I feel like there is a big question of how we can transition as something that's not just like, there is transition studies myself too. I've gone through a lot of university departments that are doing the research on the green transition and so on, but I'm trying to look at transition not as a techno-scientific problem, and definitely not one of like techno fixes, but as something that is actually, that involves a really embodied and subjective process and a collective process very much too. So not at all just individual, but that's like a process that also involves finding new narratives, and that sometimes involves kind of tripping a little bit. Tripping in the sense of like, being really open and hallucinating a little bit maybe, or finding like weird contradictions. I mean, there's a story in there about me going to an Airbnb. I don't know, that was like a trippy experience for me. When you'll read it, you'll see a kind of weird class and care trip. And tripping in the sense of like tripping over stuff where you don't know the answer, but you have the material thing that makes you trip. So it's also just kind of trying to offer different stories of how we might face this earthcare transitioning as a process that's both collective and individual, and that is that needs to be embodied and kind of creative also. Maybe.
Okay, let's dig into some of the concepts then.
Okay.
Let's start with care. This is a term that has become very central to a lot of radical thinking over the last, I would say, certainly the last 40 years, but really, like, if we just count the number of books in this bookstore that have the word care in the title, it's really exploded over the last 10 or 15 years. What do you think this book, which of those like legacies inspired you, and what do you think makes this book different?
The book, I think it plays on care. I've worked on care for many years, right? And there is like certain theories and kind of conceptualizations of care that I find useful, and I can go into that in a minute. But it somehow, it tries to hold the tension between care and social reproduction as a term. And so maybe care is sometimes read through a bit more of a liberal kind of lens. And actually one of the theorists that I quote a lot, Joan Tronto, she has some really useful stuff, but it is still within largely more of a liberal framework, let's say. And then there is a social reproduction theory, and there's, writers like, thinkers like Silvia Federici and so on, who might also be critical of the care term on a certain, when it becomes not quite materialist enough, right? Or when it becomes associated with, when it becomes maybe a little bit too subcultural and too individualist in its kind of expression. But to come to the care term specifically, I think one key question that I like to ask, and that the book asks in many ways, is what would it mean for us to care as we would like to? So it's, on the one hand, against the idea that it's only ever about caring more, because the care terminology is a lot about inducing guilt very often, right? And it has its root, it's etymologically and so on. And politically, historically, it's very linked to charity and all kinds of, right, technologies of governance and oppression that are deeply problematic. So it's not a question of caring more, but it's the question is really, how do we want to care? And I'm not the first person to say this, like Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, who writes a lot about care, for instance, also says this. And so what would it mean for us to care as we would like to, I think is a useful question, because it doesn't take for granted what care means. And and for instance, with Tronto, I can try go through it really quickly and you can shut me up, but Tronto talks about different phases of care, and this is like from a book in the 90s, so it's not new stuff, but I find it really useful. She talks about care as this moment of seeing that there's a problem, paying attention to that, and she calls that caring about. So that's the moment we recognize there's a problem. So it's about, care is about attention on the one hand. Then there's a second level that's about taking care of. That's when we have seen the problem, but we proceed to take some kind of action on it. It can be a one-off gesture. It can be just giving you some water because I think you're thirsty, or changing the nappy or whatever. Then she talks about a third phase that would be caregiving. So that's the labor of care that's like sustained. That's really where, women's and subaltern work would be. Like, it's that work that is not really seen as work, it's often not paid, it's devalued, it's seen as dirty, and so on. Like a key domain of feminist struggle, right? And then there's being cared for, or care receiving. That's the fourth phase of care. And that's super important, I think, with more recent feminist thinking around vulnerability. So it's this idea that actually it's not just, and there's a little bit my own spin on it, but it's not just caregiving that requires actually a lot of skill and is actually skilled work, we could say. But in fact, care receiving is also an art and a skill, let's say, in itself. It takes a lot of knowledge and understanding to be able to ask for the care when we need it, or to be able to provide it for ourselves, right? And so that's where vulnerability comes in, and that's also a key form of care when it comes to ecological crisis, for instance, where it's really important to recognize vulnerability, to find other ways of dealing with this crisis that aren't just about, again, being the sovereign, that just tries to dominate the problem at the expense of all kinds of other forms of life. And then there's caring with, which is like a fifth form of care that Tronto also mentioned in her theories. So I play a lot with these four forms of care. And with Tronto's theory, and in general, I think the idea would be that none of us should be stuck in one of these forms of care only, but we are in the forms of division of labor that we have in our societies. Some people are caregivers, they pay shittily, they barely have time, to read a book, or maybe care about things that are more abstract and away from them. Not because they don't care, but because maybe the structural conditions don't permit them to do so. And then, like for instance, in climate crisis, some of us in the global north are there doom scrolling and seeing all the news and the IPCC reports of how things are going to hell, but we feel like we have no form of caregiving, like no form of actually laboring in a continuous way that can address this. All we can do is maybe a little gesture, sign a petition, like little forms of taking care of, green consumerism. So these kind of concepts are quite useful, I think, for thinking about what it might mean to care as we would like to, and to kind of and to call bullshit on some kind of notions and mobilizations of care.
I think that's, that kind of like taking care of it, or electing someone who's going to take care of it for you, or trusting that some tech overlord is going to take care of it for you, is this, it comes back throughout the book as this kind of like either claiming of a really destructive form of sovereignty, or handing over our power to some destructive form of sovereignty. And in contrast to that, throughout the book, you come back to this this notion of planning or counter planning. What does that mean in the context of earth care? Because I think and maybe where we could begin by getting into that is by talking about the figure of the prepper, and maybe you could contrast the kind of like hyper masculine nationalist fascist prepper to the other kinds of preppers that are throughout this book.
I think care counter planning would be a kind of planning that doesn't see vulnerability as a liability that is to be eliminated, and that doesn't see interdependence as a problem or a variable to be managed, but that really thinks that we need both autonomy and interdependence, and so that we find ways of planning or working towards worlds, let's say, where there will be an openness to also be interdependent and to others and to be vulnerable somehow. So coming to the prepper, prepping, prepping can probably mean a lot of things, but what it means in the way that we might know it from, mainstream culture and so on, is usually men of a certain economic standing, mostly white men, who would prep as in the face of, often doomsday narratives. And what prepping means there is like you prepare yourself with gadgets and whatever, often very techie gadgets too, to defend a very circumscribed group, mostly. Sometimes it's just yourself, or it can include the family. Sometimes it's maybe kind of ethno-nationally defined, against migrants that are coming or whatever. But it's the idea of defending yourself against an outside threat. And what care in itself is, and so it's thinking ahead in the face of this threat, like based on a politics of fear. And what care is very much about thinking ahead all the time. What we would call the mental load, what people do, when you look after somebody else or you care for somebody else, you're actually constantly planning ahead for, when do I have the nappies? What's the next meal? Like when it comes to kids and so on. So what I say in the book, in the sense that there's constant prepping, if you like, going on with care, but it's not in the sense of a defense of another, but it's more in the sense of enabling the growth and the sustenance of the other in a context of a community. And so counter-planning and counter-prepping would be ways of trying to escape the politics of fear, working with trust, working with the fundamental vulnerability and uncertainty that will always be there when we organize, not trying to master that completely, but trying to find smart ways of building infrastructures and kind of patterns and practices that can allow us to read each other's needs and our interdependencies and see that as something that is actually empowering, rather than trying to eliminate our interdependency. So it's very much a critique of this kind of liberal idea of independence, right? Which we have in law and which we have in politics, and which is also quite inscribed in the ways we talk about democracy very often. Mm-hmm. So the book goes also quite deeply into a critique, for instance, of this kind of idea of democracy, and it proposes like notions that come, and I learn a lot from all kinds of social struggles and collectives, for instance, from feminist collectives like the Precarias a la Deriva in Spain that have that propose the notion of care-tisanship against citizenship. So that would be like one tool or element also of how we might understand the way that we belong, and that we might make plans together, not based on what passport we hold, what citizenship we hold, but based on how we look after one another.
Yeah, I wonder if you could go into some of the inspiring examples or things that have really stuck with you from doing the Earthcare Fieldcast and talking to so many of these different groups, to help us concretize that idea of like how are inspiring groups counter-planning and counter-prepping these days.
So with the Common Ecology School, we've been working a lot through courses and through making books, and all these. The Earthcare Fieldcast is very much a kind of research tool that we use to then produce encounters and co-research processes. So it's kind of very much embedded within the processes of co-research that we have, and very often it's about learning different kind of tools and tactics from different movements. So when it comes to Earthcare, this is often to do with either reclaiming land through campaigns, legal tactics and tools, but also occupation and sometimes forms of kind of confrontation that put the body on the line. And also forms of, I'll stick with agriculture as an example, right, of agricultural practice that build other forms of economy and livelihood. And the book tries to think beyond this idea of wages, which is another part, right? So I'm talking about livelihoods in the sense of this could be agrarian cooperatives or different forms of farm and land ownerships and models of land ownerships that are being explored. And I think what's at stake across all of them is something that the podcast also reflects very much, is trying to look both at what we would call sort of more utopian style prefigurative practices that invent like other ways of doing agriculture. So those would be agrarian co-ops, or like super cool anti-racist agroecological collectives that are made up, like in France, there's a collective called Acatre. There's actually folks who used to work mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, who used to work in industrial agriculture and have started to build their own co-ops and own kind of educational tools, amongst many other things, also saying we have the knowledge of how to deal with droughts and stuff like that. So can somebody please actually like see us for what we are, which is very often people coming from peasant backgrounds and knowing so much about how to do agriculture beyond this extractive model. So it's about people setting up these other infrastructures and, or organizational forms and so on. Community gardens, food co-ops. There's a whole plethora of these kind of examples with agriculture, but also defensive struggles. So not just the utopian nice stuff, but also the kind of struggles within the belly of the beast, if you like. And that's, for instance, struggles like the Jornaleras de Huelva en Lucha, which is a kind of anti-racist feminist collective of people or network of people that are working within industrial agriculture in the south of Spain, picking berries in that case, where it's about fighting for labor rights and also making ecological demands, as a matter of fact, but from as kind of really super exploited land workers, or kind of landless farmers, we could call them also. And also all these defensive struggles that are about maybe blocking agrarian capitalist infrastructure or occupying land. So trying to always say, we need to hold these two things together, be very careful never to pit them against each other and say, this is just the hippies, they're just setting up their other farms, and that's the real battle is over there. But also, so it's there's a kind of a labor in there of trying to articulate these.
Yeah. One of the concepts that I really like in this book is death care. And I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the politics of death care in this context, because I think one of the misapprehensions that many people have about care as a political category is that it's just about like warm and fuzzy feelings and, positive affect and, but in fact, I think one of the nice things that you articulate in this book is that if you have a deep connection to land and you are vulnerable to land as well as to the dense relationality around land, then you have to take responsibility with death, let's say, and that's not just in the sense of like being open to death, but also in some cases being open to causing death. And sometimes that quite literally in terms of, people who work with more than human forms of life, like weeding is a process of killing and dying, but also thinking about the death of systems that people rely on. You know, like this global techno-agricultural system, billions of people rely on it, and you know, like when we think about the death of that system, we have to contend with what that means. So I don't know, the concept of death care felt to me really, really capacious here as a way of kind of not erasing those contradictions, but getting us to just dwell with it in the muck.
Yeah, I mean, I guess death care, we could say that it's maybe also about taking responsibility for a transition that we produce. So, I mean, if we think about the transition that we would need from away from this toxic kind of industrial capitalist model of agriculture, we do need to build the alternative infrastructures that will be able to feed us, right? So you can't just switch one thing off without building the world that we want. But in that in the book concretely, with the stories that it sort of tells, it thinks about death care. There's like a spectrum, let's say, from the vegan movement that maybe doesn't think too much about death care, or just has maybe a bit of an idea that you can totally avoid that. And the vegan movement is in quite a lively, maybe not dispute, but in contradiction, let's say, with some agroecological peasant movements, especially that work with livestock, where there is killing involved. And so there's really interesting debates between the vegan feminists and the kind of peasant feminists, but the book refers a little bit to that. But then on the other side of the spectrum is the kind of the industrial meat industry, right? Like this kind of hellholes of these kind of death trap hellholes of raising animals as if they were inert and not sentient or whatever. And so the book has a few stories or a few chapters in there about the meat industry in Denmark specifically, and the slaughterhouse industry, and also the role of migrant labor within it, and so on. But this question of if we do eat meat, what does it mean to give death to an animal, right? And there are so many, from the peasants up to different kinds of indigenous ways of thinking about what it means to bring a life to a close through your own agency and transition it into, or metabolize it into something else. Death care would be trying to assume, like you said, responsibility, and also be conscious of producing that transition in a way that is maybe caring still, you know, and that involves different kinds of ritual and different forms of recognition of another, because what you have in the big slaughterhouses, and you know, I write about these slaughterhouses that kill 15,000 pigs a day, and there's nobody seeing that killing. The killing is completely automated. It's kind of like with AI, with AI automated kind of killing. So that's the exact opposite of death care. Like that's outsourcing death. And obviously in our cultures we have a general tendency to not want to speak about death, right? So it tries to address this taboo in some sense by thinking about what kind of cultures of death care we could learn from and might need to build in order to face the world we need to build and the systems we need to build.
I have two more questions, and then we'll go to the audience. And audience, I just want to tell you what I'm going to do, which is I'll after I've asked these two questions, we'll pause for like a minute to just meditate, and then I'll invite everyone in the audience to ask a question or say a thing if they want, but you can also pass. But I just want to give you a heads up of what I'm going to do so you're not surprised and put on the spot. I think that where we just ended your last comment about the let's call it pathological vitalism of the bad thing in this book. You know, the modernist, progressive, not progressive in the political sense, but the progress narrative, techno-sovereigntist, patriarchal bullshit paradigm. Your book kind of brings us to this in its full horror with the arrival of so-called artificial intelligence at the end. And I think that example you just gave of these like slaughterhouses where like no human is even seemingly involved. Many humans are of course involved, but there's, you know, it's a completely automated death machine, resonates deeply with the kind of pathological visions of Silicon Valley
Yeah.
that you speak about, and the need to resist them, and the examples of people resisting them. And I'm thinking here particularly about the connection between the kind of slaughter of animals and then obviously the slaughter of people by companies like Palantir and the rest, who of course are active in enabling Israel's genocide in Gaza and elsewhere. And I guess there's something interesting about the way that you're grappling with the question of what this thing that they call artificial intelligence is, which, as you point out in the book, I think quoting Kate Crawford, is neither artificial nor intelligent.
Yeah.
You know, but how are you thinking about artificial intelligence coming out of this? You know, a book that is very much grounded in the relationship between people and the earth.
Yeah. So there's a few manifestos in that book. There's like a few different formats this book takes, right? And there's like these stories, they're quite poetic, and then somehow I ended up writing manifestos. I don't know why the fuck I did that, but I did it. And so there's a kind of anti-AI manifesto in there too, and maybe I could just read out the kind of headlines of it in a minute. But basically the third section of this book, which is the one that I wasn't really expecting to write, but ended up writing, is about technology. And the book so it starts with the first part that is more thinking about care and also those theories of care and all these questions that we talked about earlier. The second part of the book is about agriculture and starts to think, though, about the role of technology in agriculture and the role of capitalist technology in legitimizing the whole narrative of modernization, progress, and so on, right? Which is actually very often resisted, this kind of technology. And I mean, right now, people are revisiting the Luddites very often. There's been a lot of sort of proto-Luddism in agriculture, right? And so one of the stories that also I take from elsewhere is, in this book is John Berger's story from his Into Their Labors trilogy, which is such a beautiful set of 3 books, where he talks about this farmer who doesn't want to invest in a tractor and the kind of fight he has with his son over it. And so there's this question of technology in this third part of the book. And what that third part tries to do, learning from peasants especially, but also from kind of contemporary peasant movements like, oh my God, now I have to see if I am thinking. There's no, I'm going to come back to that later, but there's a French movement, I don't know why the hell I don't remember their names now. They're kind of hacking agricultural dispositives. Oh, yeah. I've been talking about them yesterday. They're called... Anyways, yes. And so we get to this question of technology, and basically what the book tries to do is sort of propose maybe a little bit to reclaim the term technology. And there it's, again, not something that I have come up with from scratch, but, you know, Ursula Le Guin has already written, you know, a long time ago saying... in relation to sci-fi, which is very often when it's written by men, some sort of weird-ass fantasy of like fancy machines. And so that's obviously what Le Guin's sci-fi does not try to do. So that's what's feminist also about the sci-fi in some sense. She says, well, you know, technology for me could be anything that I don't really know how to make myself, actually. Maybe a spoon is already a technology. And so there's the way in which this word technology has been hijacked by this narrative to apply only to, like, in our mind now, it's like digital high tech, right? Even the idea of high tech against low tech is something that feminists have critiqued a lot. And hacker movements are playing with a lot. So that third part of the book plays a lot with this idea of what could other imaginaries of technology be, and what could earth-caring technologies be, or earth-caring uses of technology. Which doesn't mean anti-tech necessarily, but it would mean like other kinds of tech. And AI obviously being the like ultimate abhorrent example of how this narrative kind of culminates in some crazy kind of patriarchal, sovereign, toxic regime that obviously is not at all to do with intelligence, like you say, nor is it particularly artificial. It's actually very material. And so the book also is written at a moment where it felt very important to just emphasize the very material aspects of AI, and also, like Kate Crawford does in her book, also the labor aspects and the fact that humans are very much involved, but also there's a hell of a lot of soil involved. And I'm very glad I have it in there, because I think we're living in an age of immense, and this is testified to by McKinsey's report and so on, of immense infrastructural expansion. And what we're seeing coming at us, for instance, with the expansion of data centers, is really no joke in terms of energy use and land grabbing and so on. And it's actually deeply linked also to agriculture. I'm not answering this question exactly as you intended to, maybe, but it's deeply linked to agriculture because it's very often agricultural land that is being grabbed for the construction of data centers. And the narrative that's being used for that is also, it's on the one hand, farmers already being pushed to the brink of not being able to subsist in the way that because of how the subsidies work and so on. And so they're kind of pushed to sell the land. And the idea being that the land is already kind of empty. So there's also a big critique in there, and I think that I would really like to build on also in my future work of like the idea of something as an empty land, right? Or the countryside as being empty. Like, why is it empty? We need to see. It's usually because people have been displaced, and it's always also because people have fought against it. And those kind of histories are important to dig out. And on top of that is where like data centers and all these tech sovereignties being constructed. I can look really quickly. The Earthcare Tech Manifesto. Yeah, no, I think it's okay. I don't need to read out the titles because they're not as slogany as I thought they were.
Yeah.
But basically, there's a big critique of AI in there in terms of it's ecological, it's human, it's affective, it's it's very 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 many anti-caring and kind of toxic effects.
Yeah. Okay, I promise. Last question. Just because I think it's a really important point that you make throughout the book, and it's about labor. And you point out at some point that like the old version of like the worker that was a major organizing point for the left, for socialists, for people who want to change the world for the last 100 years, on the one hand excludes reproductive labor and care for the most part, but it also excludes labor with the land. And this is a prompt not only to say that our concept of labor needs to expand to include these, but that actually we need to fundamentally change our understanding of what labor is. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that in the context of another major sort of stream in the common ecologies school, which is like eco-syndicalism, and sort of the movement of at least really amazing parts of the trade union movement towards refocusing on ecology.
Yeah, so I mean, eco-syndicalism, let's say there is like this one question of how does labor need to be, like labor in the sense now of wage labor, need to be transformed, production needs to be transformed, right, to not destroy the planet. So there's this question of what would it mean not just to care as we would like to, but also to work as we would like to, and what do we want work to do for us also as a community and as a species, even if we want somehow. So what do we want out of work? And there's a lot of people, right, organizing within unions and so on that we work with common ecologies that are trying to push within this frame still of socio-ecological transition of labor for other forms of production, other regimes of production. Sometimes all this borders on greenwashing, right, and it's a complex terrain because you're within the sphere of capitalist production. But then there's this other kind of critique of wage labor, let's say, that I make in this book, which is basically about saying wage labor alone is not going to save us. You can include more and more people into wage labor, and yet you're always going to need more and more people who reproduce these wage laborers. And in fact, so many people who have ways of subsisting outside of wage labor, from indigenous peoples from colonial times to now, to peasants and other forms of communities, or also just like commons movements that exist right now, pose a threat to capitalism, and are usually and have been through this history of capitalism and its kind of patriarchal legacy quite annihilated, with this idea that it's good to include them into the economy, defined as a waged labor economy. And there's a lot of feminists that are kind of criticizing this narrative in the sense that Of course, it's very important that nobody's saying that all factory workers should just go and die or whatever. And there's really important workers' movements that inspire us and that we learn from a lot. But actually, what Stefania Baca calls the forces of reproduction, there's not just the forces of production, but there's also the forces of reproduction, are actually maybe quite likely the more powerful terrain of transformation that we need to look towards today. And so just it's like the kind of critique also of the feminist glass ceiling idea, right? It's just, well, you just have to, you might be a woman in a business full of men, but you just have to really work hard, and then you can also sit there in a suit and also make really toxic decisions, and so being included in the wage is often, it's a bit like that, and so from feminist movements has also been, this is related also to my previous research on childcare commons and a lot of kind of young mothers who are in the context of precarity have sort of stopped buying into this idea that you should have like your triple work, that you should have a wage job and that you can do everything at the same time, and who are no longer lured by this idea that you're going to make it somehow. And so there's Stefania Baca's work is an important reference with that, also because, again, it thinks workers, like, industrial or other kinds of worker struggles together with this. So it's very important not to kind of play these two out against each other. But the book does dwell a little bit on this critique of wage labor as a horizon. And that harks back to also, for instance, the peasant experience, where, there's also something John Berger writes about, where the left, this kind of a progress-oriented, traditional left, has completely failed to understand or defend peasants because they were seen as backwards by the left and abandoned. And yet, I think they're actually quite important subjects of transformation and revolution and so on. And it's now it's 500 years since the kind of peasant wars in Central Europe and so on. So there is some remembering happening right now. But so the book is like a part of a general kind of refocusing of attention back to those struggles and the kind of horizons of possibility that come from them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we give you a break for a few minutes, and now we turn it over to you, the audience. So what I would propose to do is I give you just a minute.